When my husband casually leaned across our table at a five-star restaurant and told me his friends thought I was not remarkable enough for him, I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply looked at him, took a sip of my wine, and replied that he should go find better. That same afternoon, I quietly canceled our upcoming anniversary trip to Paris, withdrew my financial backing from his secret business debts, and locked away every asset I owned. 2 weeks later, at exactly 5 in the morning, my phone lit up. It was Julian, his arrogant white brother-in-law, sobbing hysterically through the receiver. He begged me to answer, crying that something terrible had happened, and they were about to lose everything. I just smiled, ended the call, and took another sip of my wine. Before I share how I brought a grown man to his knees and dismantled my husband's fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant partner exactly who they were dealing with. My name is Nia, and I am 34 years old. To the outside world, my husband Marcus and I were the ultimate Atlanta power couple. Marcus was a 36-year-old mid-level sales director who desperately wanted to be seen as upper class. He wore tailored suits, leased a luxury car he could barely afford, and constantly obsessed over his image in the wealthy African-American elite circles of Buckhead. I let him have his spotlight. I preferred quiet luxury. I dressed in simple silk blouses, kept my social media presence minimal, and kept my work entirely private. Marcus told everyone I did freelance tech consulting from home. He thought it was cute. He thought it was harmless. He had absolutely no idea that my little work from home gig was actually a highly successful artificial intelligence software firm specializing in supply chain logistics that I had built completely from the ground up. Marcus was always deeply insecure about money, though he masked it with unbearable arrogance. He came from a humble background, but acted like he had inherited a massive family dynasty. He spent thousands trying to impress people who did not even know his last name. He wanted to run with the city heavy hitters, the real estate moguls, and the top-tier executives. But he did not have the capital or the work ethic. Instead, he relied on projecting an image of extreme wealth, an image that I secretly funded. Whenever he overextended himself on a designer watch or an exclusive country club membership, I quietly paid the balance. I thought I was being a supportive wife. I thought I was protecting his pride. I did not realize I was funding my own disrespect. His sister Chloe was exactly the same. She was 32, incredibly vain, and always looked at me like I was a charity case Marcus had taken in. She married Julian, a 35-year-old white man who fancied himself a venture capital genius. Julian loved to use tech buzzwords. He loved to talk down to me at family gatherings, explaining basic financial concepts as if I were a small child. Because I never wore designer logos or bragged about my income, Julian assumed I was just a dependent wife riding on Marcus's coattails. Chloe fed into this, constantly giving me backhanded compliments about my simple wardrobe or my lack of ambition. I smiled through it all. It was almost entertaining watching them parade their leased cars and maxed-out credit cards, while I sat on a fortune they could not even comprehend. For 5 years, I played the role of the quiet and supportive spouse, but over the last year, Marcus's gratitude morphed into toxic resentment. He started making subtle digs about my appearance. He complained that I did not network enough, that I was not flashy enough to be the wife of a rising executive. He wanted a trophy, someone who would post heavily filtered photos on social media and beg for attention. I was too busy securing patents and expanding my software company globally to care about internet validation. My silence in the face of his arrogance only fueled his audacity. The breaking point was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow and calculated disrespect that culminated during what was supposed to be a celebratory month. Marcus had been hinting that he and Julian were on the verge of securing a massive investment for a startup idea they had thrown together. They were insufferable. Julian would call our house late at night, hyping Marcus up, telling him they were about to be multi-millionaires. Marcus started treating me not just as a subordinate, but as an embarrassment. He told me I needed to step up my game if I wanted to stand beside him at the top. I watched this man, whose entire life was subsidized by my silent success, tell me I was not enough. I watched Julian and Chloe enable his delusions, encouraging him to seek out a woman who matched his new and imaginary tax bracket. They had no idea that the very ground they stood on was paid for by me. They did not know that the venture capital world they were so desperately trying to break into was my playground. And they certainly did not know that when the time came, I would not shed a single tear as I burned their fragile fantasies to ash. It is funny how quickly arrogance shatters when the money stops flowing. The morning Julian called me, his voice was barely recognizable. The smug and condescending tech bro who loved to mock my simple lifestyle was reduced to a weeping mess. He was begging for mercy from the very woman he had spent years underestimating. He told me Marcus was in serious trouble, that the authorities were involved, and that their grand business venture had collapsed overnight. He pleaded with me to use my influence to save them. I listened to his panicked breathing through the phone receiver, letting the silence stretch out just long enough to make him sweat. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I simply ended the call, set my phone face down on the marble kitchen island, and watched the sunrise over the Atlanta skyline. They wanted a woman who was remarkable. They were about to learn exactly how remarkable I could be. Let me take you back to how that exact night unfolded. The atmosphere inside the Buckhead Steakhouse was thick with the scent of seared, dry-aged Wagyu, expensive cigars, and the desperate energy of people trying to prove their net worth. Our table was situated squarely in the center of the main dining room. It was a strategic choice Marcus made to ensure he was seen by the right people. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the white linen tablecloth, illuminating the absolute farce that was my marriage. If you had watched us from across the room, you would have seen 4 successful adults enjoying a lavish Friday night out in Atlanta. But close up, the reality was a masterclass in delusion. Julian was completely in his element. He sat across from me, aggressively swirling a glass of Cabernet that cost more than his monthly car payment, a payment I knew he was severely behind on. He was wearing a navy blazer over a graphic t-shirt, perfectly cultivating that careless tech bro aesthetic. For 20 straight minutes, he dominated the conversation with a barrage of empty buzzwords. He talked about disrupting the market, leveraging blockchain synergies, and securing seed capital for an app idea that sounded like nothing more than a glorified spreadsheet. Whenever he spoke, he made sure to project his voice so the neighboring tables could hear his assumed brilliance. At one point, he leaned forward, looked at me with a patronizing tilt of his head, and decided to explain the concept of supply chain integration to me. He spoke slowly, using simple and insulting analogies, treating me like a naive housewife who could barely grasp basic mathematics. He told me that venture capital was a high-stakes game, a world where only the sharpest and most aggressive minds survive. I nodded politely and took a bite of my steak. I did not bother mentioning that my own company had just finalized a $45 million acquisition deal that very morning. I also did not mention that the specific venture capital firm he was desperately trying to secure a meeting with was managed by my personal wealth advisor. Chloe sat next to him, feeding eagerly off his arrogance. She was draped in a sequined designer dress that screamed for attention, clutching a luxury handbag she had purchased right after taking a secretive and massive loan from Marcus. A loan that was naturally funded by my bank account. She kept touching her hair and scanning the room to see who was looking at her. When she noticed I was quietly observing them, she immediately targeted my appearance. She reached over and touched the sleeve of my pristine, unbranded silk blouse. She gave a little sigh of fake sympathy and said it was so brave of me to embrace such a plain, modest look while out at such a high-end establishment. She bragged about her own outfit, reminding everyone at the table exactly how much it cost. She told Marcus that he needed to take me shopping, that as a rising executive, his wife needed to look the part. She stated loudly that it was a highly competitive world out there, and an invisible wife was a major liability to a successful man. Marcus ate up every single word. Instead of defending me, he flagged down the waiter and ordered another $200 bottle of wine just to prove he could afford to spoil his family. He puffed out his chest, agreeing with Julian about the harsh realities of the corporate world. He talked about his own job as if he were the chief executive officer of the company, rather than a mid-level director who had been passed over for promotion twice in the last year alone. He boasted about his connections, dropping names of influential African American business leaders in Atlanta, men who barely knew he existed outside of passing him in a lobby. He was sweating with the effort of trying to match Julian's fake energy. The dynamic was entirely toxic. A white man with a massive superiority complex, feeding the deep insecurities of a black man, desperate for validation, both of them bonding over their shared delusion of grandeur. And there I sat, the silent architect of their entire lifestyle, paying for the steak they were chewing and the wine they were drinking. The conversation inevitably shifted to the wives of Marcus's colleagues. Marcus leaned in, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of envy and bitter resentment. He started listing the women he followed on social media, wives who were constantly posting photos from luxury resorts, wives who threw lavish charity galas, wives who aggressively marketed their husbands to the public to elevate their social status. He looked at me and his expression hardened. The facade of the happy husband melted away completely, revealing the bitter, deeply insecure man underneath. He told me that a successful man needed a partner who amplified his status. He complained that I never wanted to host large, flashy parties, that my lack of a social media presence made him look like he was hiding me, and that my freelance consulting gig was simply not prestigious enough to brag about at his country club. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell or cause a scene. He delivered his insults with a cold, calculated precision, meant to break my spirit right there at the table. He said he was exhausted from carrying the weight of our public image entirely on his own shoulders. Julian nodded in solemn agreement, taking a slow sip of his wine, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my public humiliation. Chloe leaned closer, her eyes bright with malicious glee. Then Marcus delivered the final blow. He set his fork down, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and stared at me with pure disdain. He said his friends had been making comments about us. He said they noticed how I faded into the background, how I brought nothing spectacular or valuable to the table. He told me that I was simply not remarkable enough for a man of his caliber. He finished by stating clearly and deliberately that he could easily do better. The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the air. For a fleeting second, I saw the eager anticipation on all three of their faces. They were waiting for my voice to tremble. They were waiting for me to apologize, to shrink into myself, to beg for his validation and promise to change. In their minds, I was a dependent, boring woman who had just been put in her place by a powerful and wealthy man. They had absolutely no idea who was sitting across from them. They did not know that the custom suit Marcus was wearing was paid for by the dividends of my software patents. They did not know that Julian's entire startup pitch was based on outdated logistics models that my company had rendered obsolete 3 years ago. They thought they had cornered a mouse, completely unaware they had just provoked a lion. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the heavy weight of his disrespect to fully settle over the table. I looked at Julian's smug face. I looked at Chloe's eager, cruel eyes. Finally, I looked back at Marcus. The man I had supported, protected, and loved for 5 years had just discarded me for the sake of impressing two people who were equally as broke and fraudulent as he was. It was the most clarifying moment of my entire life. The love I had for him evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp, and highly strategic focus. I took my final sip of wine. It tasted like absolute freedom. I placed my glass down gently, making sure it did not make a single sound against the table. I reached into my bag and pulled out the solid black metal card. I slid it across the white linen, the heavy thud of the metal catching their attention. I looked Marcus dead in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of warmth I had ever shown him, and delivered my response. I told him to go find better. As I stood up and walked away from the table, I did not look back. I did not need to. I knew the exact sequence of events I was about to unleash, and I knew that by the time they realized what they had lost, it would be far too late to save themselves. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open as I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night air. Behind me, the muffled sounds of clinking glass and low conversations faded away instantly. The valet immediately stood at attention, recognizing me not by flashy designer logos, but by the quiet authority I carried. I handed him my ticket. While I waited, I allowed myself a single brief moment to glance at the reflection in the dark glass of the restaurant window, to observe the aftermath of my departure. Back at the table, the scene was exactly as pathetic as I knew it would be. The waiter had respectfully approached the booth to process the payment, picking up the black metal card I had left behind. I could see the exact moment the waiter recognized the weight and exclusive tier of the card, his posture straightening before he hurried off to run the $2,000 charge. Marcus was still sitting in the leather booth, frozen in place. His posture was rigid, his shoulders hiked up toward his ears. He was visibly fighting the violent urge to react. A truly wealthy, secure man might have followed his wife to ask what was wrong or apologize for crossing a line. But a fragile man like Marcus, a man whose entire identity was built on the shaky foundation of other people's opinions, could never do that. If he chased me, he would look weak in front of Julian. If he showed any sign of panic, he would instantly invalidate the arrogant alpha male speech he had just delivered. He was trapped in the prison of his own ego. I watched through the glass as Chloe leaned over the table, waving a manicured hand dismissively in the air. I could almost hear her shrill voice telling her brother that I was just being overly emotional, that I was throwing a childish tantrum because I could not handle the hard truth. Julian slapped Marcus on the back, pouring the last of the expensive Cabernet into their glasses. They were going to laugh it off. They were going to toast to Marcus standing his ground and demanding the respect he thought he deserved. Marcus was going to convince himself that by the time he got home, I would be sitting on the edge of our bed crying and waiting to beg for his forgiveness. He was utterly convinced that the silent, unremarkable wife he had just discarded would be lost without his presence. He chose to stay and finish his drink completely blind to the fact that his entire financial lifeline had just walked out the door. The valet pulled my custom matte black Mercedes G-Wagon up to the curb. It was a vehicle Marcus constantly complained about because it did not look flashy or aggressive enough for his taste. He wanted bright neon colors and loud exhaust modifications. He never understood that true power does not need to scream to be heard. I handed the valet a crisp $100 bill, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the heavy door. The solid thud of the door shutting sealed me inside a perfectly soundproof cabin, cutting off the chaotic noise of the city completely. I gripped the leather steering wheel, taking a deep cleansing breath. For 5 years I had shrunk myself to fit into the tiny, suffocating box Marcus required to feel like a man. I had softened my edges, muted my accomplishments, and hidden my massive financial success so his fragile pride would not shatter. I had listened to him complain about his mid-level management job offering gentle encouragement while I was secretly negotiating $45 million tech acquisitions in my home office. I had tolerated his insufferable sister and her arrogant husband because I believed marriage required patience and compromise. But patience is a finite resource, and Marcus had just bankrupted his account. As I pulled out onto Peachtree Road, driving through the glittering heart of Buckhead, I did not shed a single tear. There was no heartbreak. There was no overwhelming sense of loss. There was only the terrifying razor-sharp focus of a woman who had finally been pushed too far. In my professional life, I dealt with aggressive venture capitalists, ruthless board members, and complex logistical algorithms that kept global supply chains moving. I was accustomed to high-pressure negotiations and cutting through corporate deception. I had treated my marriage as a sanctuary away from that harsh reality. I had treated Marcus softly because I believed our home was the one place I did not need to wear my armor. But sitting at that table, watching him try to perform for an audience of 2, I finally saw him clearly. He was not a leader. He was just a fragile man, playing dress-up with my money. When a woman who controls an empire decides she is done, she does not throw plates or scream obscenities. She executes a calculated dismantling of the life she built. Marcus thought I was a dependent liability. He thought his corporate salary was the pillar of our household. He actually believed his leased luxury car and his expensive tailored suits were the result of his own hard work. He had conveniently ignored the fact that his salary barely covered his extravagant lifestyle choices. Every time he wanted to impress a new client with a spontaneous trip to a five-star resort, my private accounts quietly covered the deficit. Every time he needed to bail his sister out of a reckless financial decision, I transferred the funds without a second thought. I was the invisible safety net that allowed him to walk a tightrope of arrogance, and I was about to remove that net completely. I stopped at a red light, the neon signs of luxury boutiques reflecting on my windshield. My mind was already categorizing the tasks ahead. It was like managing a complex software deployment. I needed to isolate the corrupted files, shut down unauthorized access, and completely reboot the system. I needed to cut off his access to my capital before he even realized the financial freeze had begun. He would try to use his credit cards to continue the facade tonight. He would probably take Julian and Chloe out for premium cocktails at a rooftop bar to celebrate his dominance. Let him. The final tab would be a harsh awakening. The light turned green, and I pressed the accelerator, the powerful engine roaring to life beneath me. I was heading straight back to our luxury penthouse. It was a sprawling multi-million-dollar property that Marcus loved to brag about to his friends, as if he had purchased it himself. He loved hosting extravagant game nights there, showing off the panoramic views of the city skyline, accepting praise from his peers, while I quietly arranged the catered food in the kitchen. He never bothered to check the actual deed to the property. If he had, he would have noticed that his name was nowhere on it. The penthouse belonged to a holding company, and I was the sole proprietor of that holding company. My phone resting in the center console remained completely silent. Marcus was playing the waiting game. He was employing the classic manipulative tactic of withholding attention to punish me. He thought the silence would make me anxious. He thought I would be the first one to break, to send a long, emotional text message, trying to explain my feelings and smooth things over. He was relying on the soft, accommodating version of Nia that he had grown so accustomed to abusing. But that version of Nia died the moment he told me he could do better. The woman driving home tonight was the chief executive officer of her own life. I was mentally preparing to open the hidden safe in my office to gather every legal document, every financial statement, and every piece of leverage I possessed. I was ready to initiate a total financial blackout. Marcus wanted a woman who was remarkable. I was going to show him exactly what remarkable looked like, and it was going to cost him everything. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of my building, gliding my vehicle into the reserved spot that belonged exclusively to the penthouse owner. The private elevator required a retinal scan, a security measure Marcus always found excessive, completely unaware that it was designed to protect assets he could not even fathom. The polished steel doors parted seamlessly, opening directly into my foyer. I walked across the imported Italian marble floor, the sharp click of my heels echoing through the cavernous space. The ceiling stretched high above me, and the floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The city glittered in the dark, a sprawling grid of power and money that finally felt entirely under my control. I bypassed the master bedroom and walked straight down the hallway to my private office. It was a minimalist sanctuary of dark mahogany and sleek glass, a room Marcus rarely entered because he found my work too boring to engage with. I approached the far wall and pressed a concealed button behind a large abstract canvas. The painting slid aside smoothly, revealing a heavy state-of-the-art biometric safe set deep into the concrete structure of the building. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. A soft green light flared, followed by the heavy, satisfying clunk of the locking mechanism disengaging. I pulled the thick steel door open and reached inside. I did not pull out jewelry or stacks of cash. I pulled out a heavy leather-bound folder containing the physical proof of the empire my husband had no idea existed. I carried the folder to my desk, turned on the brass reading lamp, and opened it. Resting on top was the final executed acquisition agreement for my logistics software company. The bold black ink at the bottom of the page finalized a buyout from a global tech conglomerate. The purchase price was clearly printed on the second page: $45 million. I ran my fingertips over my signature, letting the reality of my own success wash over me without the need to shrink or hide. I remembered the exact day I had signed these papers. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus had taken the day off work to play an 18-hole round of golf with Julian and a few other mid-level managers. He had come home sunburned and exhausted, complaining about how hard it was to network with the real players in the city. He had thrown his golf clubs in the corner, handed me his sweaty shirt to wash, and spent the entire evening lecturing me about how I needed to be more ambitious if I ever wanted to contribute meaningfully to our household. I had simply nodded, washed his shirt, and celebrated my $45 million victory in absolute silence. For years, I had deliberately suppressed my own brilliance so his fragile ego could take the center stage. I had structured the buyout so the funds were distributed into a private corporate trust, shielding the capital from our personal joint accounts. I had done it initially for tax purposes, but looking at the documents now, I realized my intuition had been preparing for this exact betrayal long before my heart was ready to accept it. As I sat there reviewing the financial architecture of my independence, the screen of my phone suddenly illuminated the dark surface of my desk. It was a push notification from my Platinum Concierge banking application. The alert signaled a transaction that had just been processed on the supplementary credit card I allowed Marcus to carry for emergencies. I picked up the phone, my eyes scanning the text. The merchant was Cartier. The location was their flagship boutique at Phipps Plaza. The amount charged was exactly $15,000. I stared at the glowing screen, my expression remaining completely neutral. It was not my birthday. Our wedding anniversary was still a week away, and I had already canceled the trip to Paris I had secretly booked for us. Even if it were a gift for me, Marcus had never spent more than a few $100s on my presents, always claiming that we needed to be aggressively smart with our liquid assets, while he simultaneously leased luxury vehicles for himself. A $15,000 charge at Cartier meant only one thing. He was either buying a wildly expensive watch to show off to Julian and stroke his own ego, or he was funding the lifestyle of the young, flashy woman I knew he had been circling behind my back. He had just publicly humiliated me at a steakhouse, told me he could do better, and then casually swiped my money to finance his delusional playboy lifestyle. He truly believed my wealth was his entitlement. He thought I was just a quiet, compliant bank account wrapped in a silk blouse. A cold, mechanical precision took over my body. There was no rage, there was no sorrow. There was only the clinical execution of a long overdue eviction. I unlocked my phone and opened the primary dashboard of my financial institution. I navigated directly to the card management sector. I tapped on the supplementary platinum card issued to Marcus. The screen prompted me to confirm if I wanted to temporarily freeze or permanently cancel the card. I did not hesitate. I tapped cancel. The system processed the request instantly. But I was not finished. I moved to our joint checking account, the one where his modest corporate salary was deposited, and where I regularly transferred thousands of dollars to cover the massive deficit his lifestyle created. I executed a sweeping transfer, draining every single dollar I had personally contributed to that account over the last 30 days, routing the funds safely back into my private trust. I left him with exactly what he had earned himself, which, after his exorbitant car payment and country club dues were factored in, was barely enough to cover a week of groceries. Next, I logged into the auto-pay portal. I located the recurring monthly transfer that covered the lease on his beloved Porsche. I deleted the payment rule. I found the premium health insurance policy I funded for him. I removed him as a dependent. I systematically severed every financial artery that connected his fake inflated existence to my actual hard-earned capital. With every digital click, I was dismantling the foundation of the man who thought he was standing on his own 2 feet. I set the phone down next to the $45 million contract. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Out there in the city, Marcus was likely holding a glass of expensive champagne, laughing with Julian, perhaps wrapping a $15,000 Cartier bracelet around the wrist of a woman who thought she was dating a wealthy executive. He had no idea that the credit card in his wallet was now a useless piece of plastic. He had no idea that the car he was driving was on the verge of repossession. He had no idea that the quiet, unremarkable wife he had just discarded had effectively erased his entire identity with a few taps on a glass screen. I leaned back in my chair, the soft leather conforming to my spine. I was entirely untouchable. I closed the heavy folder, placed it back into the biometric safe, and secured the heavy steel door. I walked out of the office, the hidden panels sliding shut behind me, leaving no trace of the empire I commanded. I poured myself a final glass of red wine, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked down at the glittering streets of Atlanta. The financial blackout had officially begun. All I had to do now was wait for the darkness to hit him. It did not take long. Barely 2 hours passed before the private elevator chimes echoed through the silent foyer of the penthouse. The heavy steel doors slid open and Marcus stormed inside. The sheer force of his anger seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of the room. He was breathing heavily, his designer tie loosened, and his custom suit jacket rumpled. The suave, arrogant executive who had dismissed me at the steakhouse was entirely gone. In his place stood a frantic, embarrassed man whose illusion of unlimited wealth had just been publicly and brutally shattered. He did not even wait to fully cross the threshold before he started shouting. His voice echoed off the high ceilings as he demanded to know what was wrong with me. He screamed that his card had declined at an exclusive rooftop lounge across town. He had tried to order premium bottle service to impress Julie and Chloe and a table full of new acquaintances, only to have the waitress hand the card back with a sympathetic, humiliating smile. He had been forced to excuse himself, call his bank from the restroom, and discover that his access had been completely revoked. He was furious, his face flushed with the kind of rage that only comes from deep, undeniable humiliation. Then began the masterclass in psychological manipulation. Marcus paced back and forth across the living room, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. He completely ignored the profound disrespect he had shown me at dinner. He conveniently forgot that he had told me I was not remarkable enough for him. Instead, he expertly flipped the script and made himself the ultimate victim. He told me I was mentally unstable. He said my behavior was erratic, dangerous, and deeply concerning. He accused me of having a psychological breakdown because I was insecure about my own lack of ambition. He spun an elaborate narrative where I was a jealous, bitter woman trying to financially abuse a hardworking man just because I felt inadequate standing next to his rising star. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of fake condescending pity that was meant to make me feel small. He told me that my little stunt at the restaurant was pathetic. He said that freezing his card was the action of a desperate, paranoid wife who knew she was losing her grip on a high-value man. He insisted that Chloe and Julian were right about me, that I was dragging him down with my toxic, negative energy. He painted a picture of a marriage where he was the long-suffering hero, putting up with a wife who contributed nothing but stress and embarrassment to his vibrant life. He claimed I was actively trying to sabotage his business connections by making him look broke in front of important people. I remained seated on the velvet sofa, my legs elegantly crossed, watching his performance with clinical detachment. If there were a camera capturing this moment, it would be slowly pulling back, revealing the vast, quiet luxury of the penthouse surrounding my absolute stillness, contrasting sharply with his chaotic, desperate pacing. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of defense. Defending yourself to a narcissist only validates their delusion that they possess the moral authority to judge you. I simply let him speak, allowing the sheer volume of his lies to exhaust his own lungs. I observed him the way a scientist observes a lab rat, running blindly into a glass wall over and over again. When Marcus realized his verbal assault was not provoking the tears or the frantic apologies he expected, he decided to play his final desperate trump card. He stopped pacing. He squared his shoulders, trying to project a dominance he absolutely did not possess, and announced that he was moving out. He declared that he refused to sleep under the same roof as a woman who would disrespect him so publicly. He told me he was going to pack his things and stay elsewhere until I sought professional help for my deep-rooted psychological issues. He said he was giving me the gift of space so I could sit in isolation and deeply reflect on the massive mistake I had just made. He expected me to shatter. He fully anticipated that the threat of his absence would finally break my composure. He waited for me to leap up from the sofa, grab his arm, and beg him not to abandon our marriage. He wanted me to promise to turn the credit cards back on and apologize for overreacting. I uncrossed my legs, stood up with deliberate grace, and walked silently down the hallway toward the master suite. Marcus stayed in the living room, a smug, victorious expression, likely settling over his face, assuming I was retreating to cry in privacy. But I did not go to the bathroom to weep. I walked straight into his expansive walk-in closet. I reached up and pulled down his oversized Louis Vuitton duffel bag, the exact bag I had purchased for him 2 Christmases ago. I did not bother folding his designer shirts or organizing his expensive cologne. I moved with cold mechanical efficiency. I grabbed handfuls of his tailored suits, his casual wear, and his shoes, tossing them unceremoniously into the heavy canvas bag. I swept his grooming products off the vanity and dropped them in right on top of the wrinkled fabric. I zipped the bag shut in one swift motion, the metal teeth locking together with a harsh final sound. I carried the heavy duffel back down the hallway. Marcus was leaning against the kitchen island, his arms crossed, waiting for his triumphant apology. When he saw me emerge carrying his luggage, his posture stiffened. The smugness vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden jarring confusion. I did not throw the bag at him in a fit of rage. I did not scream or hurl insults. I simply slid the heavy bag across the imported marble floor. It glided smoothly, coming to a stop right at the toes of his Italian leather shoes, directly next to the front door. I turned to face him, my expression an absolute void. I looked at this man who had spent the last 30 minutes trying to convince me I was crazy, worthless, and dependent. I did not give him a speech. I did not mention the $15,000 Cartier charge or the woman I knew he was inevitably going to run to tonight. I simply looked at his suitcase, then back up at his stunned, silent face. I told him that I thought moving out was a fantastic idea. I told him to take all the time he needed to reflect on his value. He stood there completely paralyzed, realizing his ultimate threat had just been enthusiastically accepted. The illusion of his control evaporated in real time. He opened his mouth to speak, to pivot, to somehow regain control of a narrative that had violently slipped from his grasp. But I did not give him the chance. I turned my back on him, walked over to the security panel on the wall, and reset the biometric lock for the front door, knowing the system would automatically purge his access credentials at midnight. I walked away, stepping back into the quiet sanctuary of my office. I heard the heavy front door open and click shut a few minutes later. There was not a single tear in my eyes. The trash had just taken itself out. The weekend arrived with a quiet, undisturbed serenity that I had not felt in 5 years. I woke up on Saturday morning in the center of my king-sized bed, wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets, completely unburdened by the snoring or the restless, anxious energy of a man trying to figure out how to fake his way through another day. I made myself a cup of matcha tea, walked out onto the private terrace of the penthouse, and finally picked up my phone. If a camera were capturing this weekend, it would cut back and forth in a rapid, contrasting sequence. On one side of the screen, there would be the absolute zen of my sunlit terrace, the steam rising gently from my teacup, and my perfectly calm demeanor. On the other side of the screen, playing out in vivid, desperate high definition across social media, was a chaotic circus of performative luxury. I opened the Instagram application and tapped on Chloe's profile. She had uploaded no less than 20 stories over the past 12 hours. The narrative they were aggressively trying to push was loud, clear, and incredibly pathetic. Marcus had not spent the night reflecting on his behavior or realizing the monumental error he had made. Instead, he had run straight into the arms of the backup plan he had been keeping on standby. Her name was Sierra. She was 26 years old, possessed a heavy social media following, and clearly thought she had just successfully bagged a wealthy Atlanta executive. The cross-cutting on my screen was a masterclass in delusion. Tap to the next story. There was Julian raising a glass of mimosa at a trendy brunch spot in Midtown, grinning like a fool. Tap to the next story. There was Marcus looking visibly exhausted, but forcing a massive artificial smile as he wrapped his arm around Sierra. And there, sitting prominently on Sierra's wrist, catching the morning sunlight in a deliberate close-up shot filmed by Chloe, was the $15,000 Cartier bracelet that had been charged to my emergency account less than 24 hours ago. They were not just posting to show off, they were executing a targeted malicious campaign designed entirely to break me. Chloe had deliberately tagged my private locked Instagram handle in the bottom corner of every single video. She typed petty passive-aggressive captions in bold neon letters. One caption read, "Surrounding ourselves with real women who know how to treat a king." Another read, "Major upgrades only," with a winking face emoji. They were at an upscale rooftop day party, ordering expensive seafood towers and snapping photos from every conceivable angle. I watched the digital spectacle with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a particularly unintelligent species of insect. Marcus was employing the oldest trick in the narcissist playbook. He wanted to spark a public, humiliating war. He wanted me to see another woman wearing jewelry purchased with my money so I would lose my mind, blow up his phone with angry paragraphs, and fight for his attention. He wanted me to show up at that brunch spot cause a screaming match and prove to Julian and Chloe that I was the unstable, crazy wife he claimed I was. He needed my reaction to validate his worth. He needed my jealousy to prove to Sierra that he was a highly coveted prize. What Marcus did not realize was that his little social media campaign was providing me with something far more valuable than a petty argument. He was providing me with pristine, time-stamped photographic evidence of marital misconduct and financial dissipation. I did not block Chloe. I did not block Marcus. I certainly did not respond to the tags or post a single sad quote on my own page. Silence is the most terrifying response you can give an abuser, because it offers them absolutely no data on how their poison is working. I let them keep posting. I let them keep digging their financial and legal graves with every smiling selfie. I watched one final video of Julian patting Marcus on the back, likely paying for the brunch on his own credit card, since Marcus was currently operating with frozen accounts. And then I closed the application. I walked back inside, set my empty teacup on the marble counter, and dialed a number that was going to change the trajectory of their entire weekend. The phone rang twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. It was Victoria, the most ruthless, highly sought-after family law attorney in the state of Georgia. She did not handle messy emotional divorces. She handled high-net-worth asset protection and aggressive corporate separations. I had kept her on a retainer for the past 3 years. I told Victoria it was time to activate the contingency plan. Victoria did not offer me empty sympathy or ask me how I was feeling. She operated with the same cold, mechanical precision that I did. I walked into my home office, pulled up my digital financial ledgers, and began feeding her the exact parameters of our strike. I instructed her to officially file the divorce petition first thing Monday morning, citing irreconcilable differences and financial misconduct. But the divorce itself was just the baseline. The real weapon was the prenuptial agreement. When Marcus and I got married 5 years ago, I insisted on a prenup. At the time, I told him it was just standard procedure for anyone doing freelance consulting work to protect their personal liabilities. Marcus had laughed, signed it without reading the fine print, and joked to Julian that it was cute I wanted to protect my little savings account. He had no idea that the document he signed was a legally impenetrable fortress designed to completely isolate the corporate trust holding my patents, my software company, and the holding company that owned our penthouse. I told Victoria about the $15,000 Cartier charge. I forwarded her the time-stamped screenshots of Sierra wearing the jewelry on Chloe's Instagram. Victoria noted that the purchase fell under the dissipation of marital assets clause, meaning the cost of the bracelet would be deducted directly from whatever meager personal savings Marcus actually had left to his name. But I was not done. I directed Victoria's attention to a far more dangerous issue. Over the past 6 months, Marcus had pressured me to co-sign a commercial business loan to help him and Julian launch their supposed tech startup. I had refused to sign personally. However, I knew Marcus had forged documents to secure a line of credit against one of his leased vehicles, attempting to inflate his liquid capital to impress investors. I told Victoria to subpoena the financial records of his new corporate entity immediately. I wanted a total forensic audit of his business dealings with Julian. Victoria's voice crackled through the speaker, crisp and satisfied. She confirmed that by Monday afternoon, Marcus would be served at his corporate office. The asset freeze would be legally binding, meaning he could not liquidate, transfer, or hide a single dime of his personal funds. The penthouse would be legally classified as my sole property, meaning he had zero legal right to enter the premises without a police escort to collect his remaining belongings. I ended the call with Victoria and leaned back in my office chair. The legal machinery was now fully operational. There was no reverse gear. Marcus was currently sitting on a rooftop surrounded by his sycophant sister, a racist, arrogant brother-in-law, and a 26-year-old mistress who only wanted him for his perceived wealth. They were laughing, drinking, and posting their fake victories to an audience of strangers. They thought they had won the breakup. They thought they had successfully discarded me and moved on to a brighter, richer future. They were completely oblivious to the fact that a legal and financial hurricane was gathering speed right off their coast. Sierra thought she had secured a wealthy executive, unaware that the man buying her drinks did not even have the credit score to secure a studio apartment in his own name. Julian thought he was partnering with a heavy-hitting investor, unaware that his business partner was about to be audited for fraud. Chloe thought she was upgrading her social circle, unaware that the brother she worshipped was about to become entirely dependent on her for a place to sleep. I did not need to engage in a social media war. I did not need to trade insults with a 26-year-old girl or argue with a husband who despised my success. I just needed to wait for the weekend to end. Because while they were busy playing checkers on the internet, I had just flipped the entire chessboard. Monday was coming, and Monday was going to be absolutely merciless. Monday morning arrived exactly as I anticipated. The penthouse was bathed in crisp white sunlight, entirely devoid of the toxic, anxious energy that used to pollute the space. As I sat at my dark mahogany desk, the morning light illuminating the sleek surface of my monitor, I watched the first desperate strike of a man who had no idea he was already defeated. An email popped into my private inbox at exactly 9 in the morning. It was from a discount family law attorney Marcus must have scrambled to hire over the weekend, likely using whatever meager cash reserves he had left in his personal checking account. The subject line was aggressive, demanding immediate equitable division of marital assets. I clicked open the message, my eyes scanning the text with clinical precision. The demands were absolutely comical. Marcus, through his budget lawyer, laid out an ultimatum that read like a masterclass in male delusion. He demanded 50% equity in the penthouse, explicitly stating that he had contributed to the household maintenance, completely ignoring the fact that his name was nowhere on the corporate deed, and he had never paid a single utility bill. He demanded continued access to the credit lines he claimed were essential for his business operations. But the most hilarious part of the email was paragraph 4. Marcus was formally requesting spousal support. He argued that he had sacrificed his own upward mobility to support my freelance consulting business. He claimed he was entitled to alimony to maintain the standard of living he had grown accustomed to during our marriage, a standard of living I had entirely financed. I read the words twice just to savor the sheer unadulterated audacity. He was attempting to extort a woman who possessed the exact receipts of his financial parasitism. I forwarded the email to Victoria with a single sentence: "Let him burn." I minimized the email application and opened a new tab. If Marcus was launching legal threats, I needed to see what kind of false confidence was fueling his actions. I navigated to LinkedIn. I did not have to search hard. Julian's profile was the first thing to populate my feed. He had published a massive, self-congratulatory manifesto just an hour prior. It was the typical insufferable tech bro post, filled with empty jargon and aggressive posturing. Julian had uploaded a professionally taken photograph of himself and Marcus standing in the lobby of a high-end commercial building. They were both wearing tailored suits, looking pensively off camera, as if they were visionary leaders contemplating the future of global commerce. The caption was a masterpiece of fiction. Julian wrote about the grueling journey of entrepreneurship, the sacrifice required to build an empire, and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood between him and his co-founder Marcus. He proudly announced that their new logistics technology startup was in the final stages of securing a $10 million seed funding round. He stated that they were preparing to pitch an elite angel investment syndicate later that week, claiming their revolutionary algorithm would completely disrupt the current supply chain infrastructure. He tagged Marcus, Chloe, and even Sierra, referring to them as his foundational support system. I scrolled down to the comments and saw Sierra leaving crown emojis, calling Marcus a true industry king. Chloe had replied to her own husband's post, bragging about how the boys were about to take over the city. I leaned closer to the monitor. They were trying to build a logistics technology startup. They were trying to enter my exact industry using buzzwords they barely understood, all to secure $10 million from an investment syndicate. Marcus had spent years mocking my career, calling my software development a boring, unglamorous hobby that I did in my pajamas. Now he and his arrogant brother-in-law were trying to steal the very concepts I had built my wealth upon, packaging them into a flashy pitch deck to scam venture capitalists. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also incredibly foolish. I picked up the sleek, encrypted phone on my desk and pressed a single speed dial button. My executive assistant, Elena, answered on the first ring. Elena was not just a secretary. She was a highly vetted, fiercely loyal operative who managed the intricate web of my corporate holdings. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told Elena to pull up Julian's LinkedIn profile immediately. I instructed her to track down the exact name of the registered limited liability company he and Marcus had formed. I wanted the incorporation documents, the capitalization table, and most importantly, the exact pitch deck they were circulating to investors. Elena's keyboard clacked rapidly in the background. Within 60 seconds, she had located the corporate registry. They had named their company Apex Logistics Solutions. It was a shell company registered just 3 months ago, exactly around the time Marcus started becoming aggressively distant and hyper-focused on his fake wealthy image. I told Elena to dig deeper. I needed to know exactly which angel investment syndicate they were meeting with later this week. I needed the names of the managing partners they were targeting. The line was quiet for a few minutes as Elena bypassed public firewalls and accessed our proprietary industry databases. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a distinct tone of professional amusement. She read off the name of the venture capital firm. It was a prestigious, highly exclusive fund based right here in Atlanta, known for writing massive checks to innovative tech startups. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. The corners of my mouth lifted as the absolute perfection of the situation settled over me. I knew that specific venture capital firm. I knew them intimately. What Julian and Marcus did not realize, what they could not possibly have known, was the complex financial architecture behind that specific syndicate. They saw a giant pool of money. They saw a group of wealthy investors they could dazzle with a stolen business model and a rehearsed presentation. They did not know that the primary capital backer, the silent majority shareholder who provided the actual liquidity for that venture capital firm's entire tech portfolio, was the Vanguard Trust. And the sole beneficiary and active chairperson of the Vanguard Trust was me. Marcus and Julian were putting on their best suits, printing out their fraudulent financial projections, and practicing their arrogant pitches. They were gearing up to walk into a boardroom to beg for $10 million. They thought they were about to secure the bag that would fund their extravagant, toxic lifestyle and prove to the world that they were elite businessmen. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the money they were begging for belonged to the very woman Marcus had just discarded and humiliated at a steakhouse. I instructed Elena to contact the managing director of the venture capital firm immediately. I told her to ensure that Apex Logistics Solutions was approved for a final in-person pitch meeting this coming Friday evening. I explicitly demanded that the meeting be upgraded from a standard boardroom review to an exclusive investor gala. I wanted Marcus and Julian to feel like they had already won. I wanted them to walk into a luxury venue surrounded by champagne and high society, completely intoxicated by their own inflated egos. I wanted Chloe and Sierra to be there dressed in their finest stolen luxury goods, taking photos for social media to document their grand victory. Elena confirmed the directives without hesitation. Before she hung up, she asked if I would be reviewing the pitch deck remotely or if I required her to compile a formal rejection summary for the board. I looked at the frozen image of Marcus and Julian on my monitor, standing so proudly in their borrowed confidence. I told Elena that I would not be reviewing it remotely. I told her I would be attending the gala in person. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of the penthouse wash over me. Marcus's lawyer was demanding alimony. Julian was boasting on the internet. Chloe and Sierra were likely out shopping, anticipating the imminent arrival of a $10 million windfall. They were all dancing on a stage they thought they had built, completely unaware that I was the one holding the remote control to the trapdoor. The ultimatum had been issued, but it was not going to be answered in a family courtroom. It was going to be answered on a silver platter served ice cold right in the middle of their crowning moment. 2 days later, the arrogance of a desperate man brought the fight directly to my doorstep. If a camera were capturing this sequence, it would be a smooth, steady tracking shot moving backward, perfectly framing Marcus and Sierra as they strutted through the revolving glass doors of one of the most exclusive corporate high-rises in Midtown Atlanta. Marcus was wearing a sharp, aggressively tailored suit, walking with the exaggerated swagger of a man who desperately needed the world to believe he was still in control. Clinging tightly to his arm was Sierra, dripping in visible designer logos, completely convinced she had just secured a high-net-worth executive. The Cartier bracelet Marcus had purchased with my money gleamed conspicuously on her wrist. Marcus had come to ambush me. Since I had ignored all communication from his discount lawyer, he decided the best way to regain leverage was to show up at my workplace and humiliate me in front of my peers. For 5 years, I had maintained a private office suite in this building. I had always told Marcus I rented a small shared co-working desk to manage my freelance consulting projects. He never asked for details, and he certainly never bothered to visit. In his mind, I was sitting in a cramped cubicle typing away on a laptop, surrounded by other struggling freelancers. He brought Sierra along specifically to parade his new flashy upgrade in my face, intending to make me feel small and insignificant in my own professional environment. They approached the main security desk in the ground floor lobby. I watched the security footage later, thoroughly amused by his performance. Marcus slapped his hand on the marble counter and loudly demanded that the concierge call down his wife. He referred to me by name and dismissively told the guard to check the roster for the shared rental spaces on the lower levels. The head of security, a man who had known me for years and was fully aware that my company owned the entire top 2 floors of the building, simply raised an eyebrow. The guard did not correct him. He just scanned a specialized keycard, directed them to the private executive elevator, and told them I was on the top level. During the elevator ride up, the camera would capture the smug exchange between the two of them. Sierra leaned against the mirrored wall, flipping her hair and laughing. She told Marcus that she could not believe he had spent 5 years tied down to a woman who hid in a cubicle all day. She said it was embarrassing for a man of his stature to have a wife who contributed nothing to his legacy. Marcus kissed her forehead, agreeing completely. He promised her that by the time he was done talking to me, I would be signing over my assets just to make the public embarrassment stop. He was convinced that applying pressure in my workplace would terrify me into submission. The elevator chimed and the heavy doors slid open. Marcus and Sierra stepped out, preparing to walk into a noisy, cramped room of shared desks. Instead, they stepped into a massive, breathtaking reception area of polished concrete, dark wood, and floor-to-ceiling glass. The space was completely silent, exuding an atmosphere of intimidating corporate wealth. Behind the custom reception desk, an enormous digital display illuminated the logo of my artificial intelligence software firm. Marcus faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted around the luxurious lobby, taking in the panoramic views of the city and the impeccably dressed staff moving quietly through the glass corridors. But his delusion was too deeply ingrained to shatter immediately. He assumed I just worked for this massive company. He assumed I was a low-level employee, perhaps an administrative assistant, or a minor tech support worker hiding in the back. He tightened his grip on Sierra's hand, puffed out his chest, and marched up to the reception desk. He aggressively demanded that they pull me out of whatever cubicle I was hiding in, because he had urgent legal documents for me to sign. I was already waiting. Elena had notified me the second they bypassed the ground floor security. I walked out of my private executive suite at the end of the hall, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. I was wearing a tailored emerald green dress, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an absolute void. I stopped a few feet away from them, folding my hands in front of me, and waited for him to speak. Marcus immediately launched into his rehearsed tirade. He raised his voice, ensuring that my staff in the nearby glass offices could hear him. He told me that my little silent treatment was pathetic, and that freezing his credit cards was a childish stunt that would cost me dearly in family court. He waved a folder of legal documents in the air, demanding that I sign an agreement to sell the penthouse and divide the equity. He shouted that he was tired of carrying my dead weight, and that if I did not comply, he would contact human resources and report my erratic behavior to my superiors. He actually threatened to have me fired from my own company. Sierra decided this was her moment to contribute to the spectacle. She stepped forward, looking me up and down with an exaggerated expression of pity. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh and shook her head. She told me I looked exhausted. She said it made sense why Marcus had to look elsewhere for a real woman, because staring at a boring, aging corporate drone all day was suffocating his potential. She held up her arm, deliberately flashing the Cartier bracelet in the bright office lights, and told me I should just sign the papers and let Marcus go. She said I was embarrassing myself by trying to hold on to a man who had clearly outgrown me. I stood there in complete silence, letting the sheer absurdity of their performance echo through the pristine lobby. My employees, highly paid software engineers, and corporate strategists were watching the scene through the glass walls. They were not looking at me with pity. They were looking at Marcus and Sierra with a mixture of profound confusion and secondhand embarrassment. They knew exactly who I was. They knew they were watching a broke, desperate man yell at the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar empire. I did not raise my voice to match his. I did not hurl insults at the young woman wearing jewelry I had unknowingly purchased for her. I simply looked at Marcus, my gaze cutting straight through his cheap bravado. The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating until his arrogant smirk finally began to waver. He shifted his weight nervously, suddenly hyper-aware of the fact that my entire staff was staring at him, not with respect, but with pity. He had come to my territory to intimidate a mouse, but he was slowly realizing he had walked completely unarmed into a lion's den. Marcus could feel the energy shifting in the room. The absolute silence of my lobby was suffocating him. But his pride, especially with Sierra clinging to his arm and my employees watching through the glass, would not allow him to retreat. He aggressively slammed his legal folder onto the polished concrete counter of the reception desk. He pointed a trembling finger at me and demanded that I stop playing games. He shouted that if I did not sign the agreement to liquidate our assets and give him his 50% equity in the penthouse, he would make my life a living hell. He threatened to march straight up to the executive suite, find the chief executive officer of this company, and use his rights as my legal husband to garnish my wages. He yelled that he knew the law perfectly well. He claimed he was legally entitled to the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to, and he would legally compel my employer to redirect my paychecks directly to his personal accounts if I kept locking him out of our joint finances. I did not flinch. I slowly leaned back against the edge of the custom reception desk, crossing my arms over my chest. My eyes locked onto his sharp, unyielding, and completely merciless. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy, until I finally spoke. My voice was low, perfectly modulated, and completely devoid of emotion. I told him he was more than welcome to speak to the chief executive officer of this company. In fact, I told him he was already speaking to her. I watched the words physically hit him. I watched his brain try to process the information, reject it, and then slowly, agonizingly realize it was the absolute truth. I told him that the $45 million acquisition that had been finalized on the very day he was out playing golf was my acquisition. The entire building he was standing in, the top 2 floors he was currently screaming on, was leased under my corporate trust. There was no human resources department for him to complain to. There was no boss for him to intimidate. I was the apex. Before Marcus could formulate a single syllable in response, I shifted my focus to the physical manifestations of his fake wealth. I asked him how the drive over to Midtown was. I asked if the valet downstairs had been careful with his custom Porsche. He blinked, confused by the sudden change in subject, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to catch his breath. I kept my gaze pinned on him, slicing through his remaining dignity. I informed him that he should probably enjoy the ride back, because it would likely be his last time behind the wheel. I casually mentioned that my forensic accountant had been reviewing his personal finances since Saturday morning. I revealed to him and to Sierra, who was standing right next to him, that he was currently 60 days past due on his luxury auto lease. The auto pay had failed because the account it drew from an account I solely funded had been completely drained by my attorneys. The repossession agency had already been dispatched and was currently tracking the global positioning system on the vehicle. I then turned my attention entirely to Sierra. The smug, condescending sneer she had worn just moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror. She instinctively reached up with her opposite hand to cover the Cartier bracelet resting on her wrist. I offered her a polite, chilling smile. I told her the bracelet was a stunning piece of craftsmanship. I told her it retailed for exactly $15,000. But then I explained exactly how her new boyfriend had acquired the funds to purchase it. I explained that Marcus did not buy that jewelry with his executive salary. His salary barely covered his tailored suits and his expensive lunches. I told her that Marcus had recently formed a shell company called Apex Logistics Solutions with his brother-in-law Julian. I detailed how Marcus had falsified his income and forged documents to secure a commercial business loan, claiming the capital was for operational tech expenses and software development. Instead of building a business, Marcus had taken the very first disbursement of that fraudulent corporate loan and walked straight into the Cartier boutique at Phipps Plaza to buy her affection. I looked back at Marcus. His face was now completely drained of color. He was sweating profusely under the bright modern lighting of my lobby. I explained the legal definition of wire fraud and the misappropriation of commercial funds. I told him that using a fraudulent business loan to purchase luxury jewelry for a mistress was not just a poor financial decision, it was a federal crime. And because my legal team was currently executing a massive audit of his assets to protect my wealth in the divorce, that specific fraudulent transaction had already been flagged, documented, and prepared for submission to the authorities. I stepped away from the desk, moving just a few inches closer to him, invading his personal space with quiet, absolute dominance. I looked down at the pathetic legal folder he had slammed onto the counter. I told him that he was not going to get a single dime from the sale of my penthouse. I told him he was not going to get spousal support. I told him he was going to need every ounce of energy and every favor he could pull just to stay out of a federal penitentiary. Sierra slowly unlinked her arm from his. She took a distinct step backward, putting physical distance between herself and the man she suddenly realized was nothing but a walking liability. She looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, as if it were suddenly burning her skin. She had come here expecting to mock a powerless, discarded wife, only to discover she had tied herself to a sinking ship of debt and criminal fraud. Marcus stood frozen, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. He had walked into my office to put me in my place, to assert his dominance and force me into submission. Instead, he found himself utterly stripped of his illusions. I had just dismantled his entire existence in less than 5 minutes, and I had done it without raising my voice once. He looked around the lobby, noticing for the first time that my employees were no longer just watching. Several of them had their arms crossed, looking at him with outright disgust. He had nothing left to say. His threats of calling human resources were laughable. His demands for the penthouse were dead on arrival. His shiny new girlfriend was actively backing away from him. I gestured toward the glass elevator doors. I politely informed Marcus that he was trespassing on private corporate property and that security would gladly escort him out if he did not leave immediately. I told him to take his folder, take his mistress, and get out of my building before I called the police to report a hostile disturbance. He did not say a word. The arrogant, boastful man who had strutted into my lobby was completely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of panic and impending ruin. The sudden shift from the freezing absolute authority of my corporate lobby to the frantic manufactured energy of Julian's rented office space would give anyone whiplash. If a camera were capturing this precise moment, the scene would cut sharply to a dizzying, continuous orbit, shot slowly spinning around the two men as they stood in the center of a glass-walled conference room. Julian was pouring expensive amber liquor into heavy crystal tumblers, completely oblivious to the massacre that had just occurred across town. He had rented this flashy suite in a trendy co-working building, specifically to maintain the illusion of a thriving tech headquarters. It was all smoke and mirrors, leased by the hour, designed to trick visiting investors into believing Apex Logistics Solutions was a legitimate operation rather than a hollow shell company. Marcus was standing near the window, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of a faux marble conference table. His tailored suit was still slightly wrinkled from the panic sweat that had soaked through his shirt during our encounter. He had fled my building and driven straight to Julian, but he had not spoken a single word about what had actually transpired. He did not tell his arrogant brother-in-law that my company owned the building, that Sierra had practically run away from him in the lobby, or that a forensic audit was currently tracking the fraudulent corporate loan he had used to buy Cartier jewelry. Marcus was too proud and too terrified to admit his utter humiliation. Instead, he chose the path of ultimate delusion. He desperately needed to believe that this startup venture was going to save his life, pay off his impending legal debts, and keep him out of federal prison. Julian thrust a glass of liquor into Marcus's hand, clapping him aggressively on the shoulder. He was practically vibrating with unearned confidence, his eyes wild with the anticipation of impending wealth. He raised his own glass high in the air, his voice booming off the glass walls as he announced that they were officially at the finish line. He told Marcus that the final hurdle had been cleared. The elite investment syndicate they had been chasing for weeks had just upgraded their pitch meeting. They were no longer going to a sterile boardroom review. They had been invited to an exclusive high society investor gala this coming Friday night. Julian boasted that the elusive, highly secretive chairman of the Vanguard Trust was flying in specifically to hear their presentation. Marcus forced a smile, bringing the glass to his lips and swallowing the liquor in one desperate gulp. The alcohol did nothing to warm the ice running through his veins, but the mention of the Vanguard Trust provided a false lifeline. Julian began pacing around the table, the camera continuing its slow, predatory orbit around them. Julian told Marcus that this $10 million seed round was just the beginning. He painted a vivid, delusional picture of their future. He talked about taking the company public within 3 years, buying matching yachts, and securing their status as billionaire titans of industry. He genuinely believed his own hype. He was completely convinced that his aggressive tech bro persona and his practiced corporate jargon were an unstoppable combination. Julian stopped pacing and reached down to the center of the table. He slid a thick, professionally bound portfolio across the polished surface. The glossy cover displayed the Apex Logistics Solutions logo in sharp, aggressive typography. He tapped his finger against the cover, a smug, satisfied grin stretching across his face. He called it their masterpiece. He told Marcus that this pitch deck was guaranteed to blind any investor in the room because the proprietary algorithm they were presenting was light years ahead of the current market standard. The profound irony of that statement was staggering. The algorithm was indeed light years ahead of the market standard, but that was entirely because it did not belong to them. A year prior, when Marcus and I were still pretending to have a functional marriage, he had casually walked into my home office while I was on a conference call. He had noticed a series of complex logistical equations and supply chain mapping models I had drawn out on a massive whiteboard. Believing I was just a low-level freelance consultant, Marcus had taken out his phone and snapped a few photographs of my work, thinking it looked complicated enough to impress Julian. He had later accessed a shared drive on our home network and copied a series of raw data files I had left unsecured. Marcus had handed those stolen files over to Julian, claiming he had developed the framework during a late-night brainstorming session. Julian, lacking the actual coding expertise to build anything from scratch, had taken my early-stage, highly proprietary artificial intelligence models, slapped a shiny new user interface on top of them, and rebranded the entire architecture as the foundational product of Apex Logistics. They had literally stolen the blueprints of my empire, and now they were walking into a gala to sell my own stolen intellectual property right back to me. Julian flipped the pitch deck open to the financial projections page, his voice dripping with condescension. He told Marcus that navigating the venture capital world was incredibly simple if you understood the psychology of wealthy investors. He assumed the chairman of the Vanguard Trust was some ancient out-of-touch billionaire who just wanted to park his cash in a flashy tech startup. Julian leaned across the table, his tone lowering into a conspiratorial, deeply arrogant whisper. He told Marcus that Friday night was about playing their roles perfectly. He said he would handle all the complex financial questioning and the heavy lifting during the presentation. He explicitly instructed Marcus to play the part of the charismatic, diverse co-founder. Julian actually had the audacity to say that having a black face on the executive board would make the investment firm feel good about meeting their corporate diversity quotas, ensuring the $10 million check cleared without any intense scrutiny. Marcus did not object to the blatant racism of the comment. He did not care that he was being used as a prop by a mediocre white man who had contributed nothing but stolen ideas and unearned arrogance. Marcus was entirely consumed by survival. He stared down at the stolen code printed on the glossy pages. He told himself that $10 million would fix everything. He rationalized that with his massive payout, he could instantly quietly pay back the fraudulent loan before the authorities came knocking. He envisioned buying a brand new luxury sports car in cash, securing a waterfront condo to replace the penthouse he had just been evicted from, and parading his new wealth directly in front of my face to prove he had won the divorce. The camera would capture the tragic, almost laughable nature of their celebration. Two fraudulent men standing in a rented glass box, raising their empty crystal glasses to toast a victory that did not exist. Julian was grinning, entirely convinced of his own unmatched brilliance. Marcus was sweating, gripping the edge of the table, using greed to desperately bandage his shattered pride. They were hyping each other up, running through their rehearsed speeches, and imagining the look on the faceless chairman's face when they delivered their revolutionary pitch. They were completely unaware that the chairman already knew every single word they were going to say. They had no idea that the $10 million check they were salivating over was bait sitting in the center of a very carefully laid trap. And they had absolutely no idea that the jaws of that trap were controlled by the very woman they had spent years trying to destroy. If a camera were capturing the exact moment the universe aligned to deliver absolute justice, it would be a tight, extreme close-up tracking shot. The lens would follow my manicured fingers as they rested lightly on the polished surface of my mahogany desk. Into the frame would step Elena, my executive assistant, her posture perfectly rigid, her expression sharp and professional. She carried a sleek, heavy custom-bound portfolio. She placed it squarely in front of me, the heavy thud of the thick cardstock breaking the pristine silence of my executive suite. The camera would remain focused on my hands as I slowly turned the cover page. Printed right there in bold, aggressive typography was the logo for Apex Logistics Solutions. Below it, the names of the co-founders were listed with unearned pride: Marcus and Julian. I traced my index finger over their names, a slow, cold smirk finally breaking through the absolute neutrality of my expression. I flipped to the technical specifications section of the pitch deck. The camera would follow my eyes as they scanned the printed code, the flowcharts, and the supply chain architecture they were presenting as their revolutionary proprietary software. It was exactly as I suspected, but seeing it printed on glossy, expensive paper made it entirely comical. Marcus had indeed stolen photographs of my whiteboard. He had copied data files from my unsecured home server network. But Marcus was a sales director with zero background in software engineering, and Julian was a venture capital fraud who only understood tech through buzzwords. Because neither of them actually understood the complex mathematics they had stolen, they had no idea they had stolen a defective prototype. The code printed in their multi-million-dollar pitch deck was an abandoned framework from 2 years ago. I had discarded that specific algorithm because my stress testing revealed it contained a catastrophic bottleneck. If any major shipping company attempted to scale that software for global logistics, the entire system would crash within 48 hours, causing massive supply chain blackouts. They were not walking into a boardroom to sell a revolutionary product. They were walking into a boardroom to sell a highly explosive digital bomb, completely unaware that the creator of the bomb was the one reading their manual. I turned to the final section of the portfolio, the target investor profile. Julian had outlined his aggressive strategy to secure seed funding. Right at the top of his target list was the Vanguard Trust. He had dedicated 3 entire pages to analyzing the investment history of the fund, praising the aggressive and visionary tactics of its anonymous chairperson. He had written a highly detailed, incredibly arrogant summary about how his company would perfectly align with the Vanguard Trust portfolio. If the camera were to slowly pan up from the document to the wall directly behind my desk, the audience would see it. Forged in solid brushed steel, dominating the executive suite, was the exact same logo printed in Julian's portfolio. The Vanguard Trust. The billion-dollar entity they were desperately trying to infiltrate was not just connected to me, it was me. Julian had spent hours researching the trust, looking for any weak point or connection he could leverage. But my legal team had done their jobs flawlessly. My identity as the chairperson and sole beneficiary was buried under layers of corporate proxies, non-disclosure agreements, and blind trusts. To the outside world, the Vanguard Trust was a faceless monolith of limitless capital. To Marcus and Julian, it was their ultimate salvation. To me, it was the perfect, inescapable trap. I closed the portfolio and pressed the silver intercom button on my desk. Elena entered the room immediately, an iPad secured in her hand, waiting for my directive. I did not look up right away. I let my hands rest on the stolen pitch deck, savoring the sheer magnitude of the power I currently held. I told Elena to cancel the standard boardroom review scheduled for Apex Logistics Solutions. Elena paused, her pen hovering over her screen, waiting to confirm if I was rejecting their application outright. I looked up at her, my smile turning sharp and predatory. I told her I was not rejecting them. I was elevating them. I instructed Elena to contact the event coordinators at the Four Seasons Hotel in Midtown Atlanta. I told her to book the grand ballroom for this coming Friday night. We were no longer having a sterile, private corporate meeting. We were hosting an exclusive high society investor gala. I wanted champagne towers, black tie dress codes, and a guest list curated to cause maximum psychological damage. I dictated the guest list to Elena with absolute precision. I wanted the top tier of Atlanta African American elite. I wanted the real estate moguls Marcus desperately tried to impress. I wanted the heavy-hitting venture capitalists Julian constantly name-dropped on social media but had never actually met. I wanted the banking executives who were currently processing the foreclosure on Marcus's assets. I wanted every single influential person in the city to be present in that room holding a glass of expensive champagne, waiting to hear the revolutionary pitch from Apex Logistics Solutions. Elena typed furiously, her own eyes widening slightly as she realized exactly what kind of execution I was orchestrating. But I was not finished. I told Elena to send a specialized, highly personalized VIP invitation directly to Julian and Marcus. The invitation needed to explicitly state that the chairperson of the Vanguard Trust had personally reviewed their preliminary financials and was extraordinarily eager to hear their presentation in front of an audience of elite peers. I wanted to feed their delusion until they were absolutely gorged on it. I also made it a strict mandate that the invitation included a +1 for both founders. They needed to bring their support system. Marcus needed to bring Sierra so she could witness firsthand the catastrophic collapse of her meal ticket. Julian needed to bring Chloe so my insufferable sister-in-law could stand in a room full of genuine wealth and watch her entire social standing evaporate in real time. They needed to be dressed in their finest stolen luxury goods, surrounded by the flashing lights of corporate photographers believing they had finally made it to the top of the mountain. Elena confirmed the venue, the guest list, and the VIP invitations. She asked if I required my legal team to be present at the gala. I told her to have Victoria and a team of forensic accountants waiting in the private suites adjacent to the ballroom, completely out of sight until I gave the signal. I wanted the police unit responsible for corporate fraud on standby. As Elena left the office to execute the plan, I turned my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the Atlanta skyline. Marcus and Julian were probably somewhere in the city right now, receiving the VIP email notification, high-fiving each other and screaming in celebration. They were probably telling Sierra and Chloe to go out and buy new designer gowns for Friday night, using credit cards that were rapidly approaching their maximum limits. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. They thought their stolen algorithm and their borrowed confidence were going to secure them $10 million. They had no idea that Friday night was not going to be a celebration of their genius. It was going to be a public, inescapable execution. I had given Marcus the opportunity to leave our marriage with a shred of dignity, but he chose to be arrogant. He chose to humiliate me. Now he was going to learn the hardest lesson of his life. You can try to steal a queen's intellectual property, but you can never steal her throne. Friday night was coming, and I was going to serve his absolute ruin on a silver platter. I watched the entire spectacle unfold in brilliant high definition from a bank of security monitors in a secluded executive suite just down the hall. If a cinematographer had choreographed the evening, the opening sequence would be a slow, sweeping tracking shot, gliding seamlessly through the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons. The venue had been transformed into an absolute masterpiece of corporate intimidation and luxury. Towering arrangements of white orchids dominated the room, while waiters in impeccable uniforms circulated with silver trays of vintage champagne and caviar. The room was packed with the exact demographic I had requested. The authentic titans of Atlanta commerce were there, mingling in small, quiet clusters. Real wealth whispers, but fake wealth desperately screams for attention. Right on cue, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open to reveal the arrivals of the hour. The camera would have pushed in slightly to capture the sheer, unfiltered arrogance radiating from the four of them as they stepped into the venue. Marcus walked slightly ahead, wearing a velvet tuxedo jacket that screamed of a desperate attempt to look influential. He stood with his chest puffed out, his eyes darting frantically around the room, taking mental inventory of the billionaires he recognized from magazine covers. Clinging to his arm was Sierra. She wore a skin-tight crimson gown that was violently out of place for a black-tie corporate investor gala, but perfect for a woman trying to secure her financial future. The Cartier bracelet, the one purchased with my stolen funds, sat prominently on her wrist, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. Following closely behind them were Julian and Chloe. Julian had opted for a bespoke suit paired with expensive designer sneakers, completely leaning into his manufactured role as a disruptive Silicon Valley visionary. Chloe trailed him in a massive designer gown, looking down her nose at the waitstaff and projecting the haughty demeanor of a woman who believed she had finally arrived at her rightful place in high society. Through the audio feed piped directly into my viewing room, I listened as they immediately began aggressively working the room. They did not ease into the gala. They attacked it like starving animals. Julian grabbed 2 glasses of champagne off a passing tray, handed one to Marcus, and marched straight toward a group of legendary real estate developers. I watched as Julian inserted himself into their private conversation completely uninvited and began aggressively dropping venture capital buzzwords. He talked about algorithmic supply chain integration and disruptive digital infrastructures. The wealthy developers simply stared at him with polite blank smiles, exchanging subtle glances of amusement. They humored Julian the way one humors a loud, misbehaving child, completely unaware that the software Julian was bragging about was stolen directly from my home office. Marcus was sweating, trying desperately to match Julian's manic energy. He handed out heavy, matte black business cards with the Apex Logistics Solutions logo stamped in gold foil. He introduced himself as the co-founder and chief operating officer, deepening his voice and laughing too loudly at jokes that were not funny. He was performing the role of an elite businessman, entirely oblivious to the fact that his bank accounts were frozen, his car was flagged for repossession, and his credit score was currently in a free fall. Meanwhile, Sierra and Chloe had found a well-lit corner near an ice sculpture to execute their primary objective for the evening. They pulled out their phones and began taking a relentless sequence of photographs and videos. They posed with their champagne glasses, adjusting their angles to make sure the luxury of the ballroom was perfectly captured in the background. Through my screen, I could literally see Chloe typing out Instagram captions about making history and closing 8-figure deals. They were immortalizing their perceived victory, documenting every second of the night so they could rub their fabricated success in the faces of everyone they felt superior to. They were digitally carving their own tombstones. After 45 minutes of watching them make absolute fools of themselves among the city elite, I decided they had marinated in their delusions long enough. I pressed a button on my communications console, signaling the event manager on the ballroom floor. On the monitors, I watched the impeccably dressed event manager approach Julian and Marcus. He bowed his head slightly, informing them in a hushed, respectful tone that the chairperson of the Vanguard Trust had arrived and was ready to receive their presentation. The physical reaction from Marcus and Julian was instantaneous. Their spines snapped straight. Julian hastily swallowed the rest of his champagne, handing the empty crystal glass to a passing waiter without even looking at him. Marcus wiped his sweating palms on the sides of his velvet trousers. They signaled for Sierra and Chloe to follow their faces tight with a mixture of raw greed and nerve-wracking anticipation. The tracking shot would follow them as they were escorted away from the noisy, glittering ballroom floor. They walked down a long, dimly lit corridor flanked by towering mahogany walls and thick sound-absorbing carpets. The atmosphere shifted from celebratory to deeply serious. 2 massive men in dark suits, my personal security detail, stood guarding the double doors of the VIP boardroom. The event manager gestured toward the doors, stepping aside to let them enter their promised land. They walked into the private boardroom. It was a cavernous, intimidating space designed to make anyone standing inside it feel incredibly small. A massive polished granite conference table stretched down the center of the room. At the far end of the room, an enormous digital projector screen dropped from the ceiling, waiting to display their stolen pitch deck. And positioned perfectly at the head of the table, facing away from the doors and looking out over the city skyline, was a single high-backed leather executive chair. Julian immediately moved to the presentation podium, plugging his sleek laptop into the audiovisual system. The Apex Logistics Solutions logo flashed onto the massive screen above them. Marcus paced near the side of the table, pulling nervously at his tight collar, muttering the opening lines of his rehearsed, entirely fabricated origin story under his breath. Sierra and Chloe walked over to a plush leather sofa in the corner of the room, sitting down and crossing their legs, whispering excitedly to each other about how many millions they were about to secure. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing them inside the soundproof room. They were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Julian clapped his hands together, pointing at Marcus and telling him to remember the plan. He instructed Marcus to just stand there, look formidable, and let him handle the aggressive financial negotiations with the old man running the trust. They stared at the back of the high leather chair, their eyes hungry, their posture radiating a toxic, unearned entitlement. They were absolutely convinced they had won. They stood there in the quiet, heavy air of the boardroom, arrogantly waiting for the faceless chairperson to turn around and hand them the keys to a $10 million empire. The heavy silence of the boardroom was suddenly broken by the soft, mechanical hum of the executive chair slowly rotating. Marcus held his breath, straightening his velvet jacket, while Julian leaned forward, ready to deploy his heavily rehearsed and arrogant greeting. But as the chair completed its rotation, their eager smiles froze completely. The seat was entirely empty. Before either of them could process the confusion, a sharp electronic click echoed from the far end of the room. The towering, solid oak double doors located directly behind the executive desk, the private entrance reserved exclusively for the highest authority of the trust, swung open with a heavy, ominous weight. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, it would drop to a low angle, tracking smoothly forward as I stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh, dramatic lighting of the boardroom. I was not wearing a simple silk blouse or a quiet, unassuming dress. I was wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored, blindingly white power suit. The sharp, structured shoulders and the flawless drape of the fabric radiated an aura of absolute, uncompromising dominance. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression carved from solid ice. I did not look like a discarded, heartbroken wife. I looked like an executioner arriving to deliver a final, inescapable verdict. Flanking me on either side was my personal vanguard. Victoria, my ruthless family law attorney, walked to my left, carrying a thick leather briefcase that held the financial autopsy of my marriage. To my right stood two of my senior forensic accountants, holding digital tablets loaded with the exact fraudulent data the men standing in front of me had tried to hide. Trailing just behind us were two massive, highly trained private security contractors. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes tracking every single movement in the room with cold precision. The sound of my heels striking the polished granite floor echoed like gunshots in the cavernous space. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pacing of a predator that has already cornered its prey. I let my gaze sweep across the room, watching the psychological collapse of the four people who had spent the last week actively trying to destroy my life. Marcus looked as though all the blood had been instantly drained from his body. His jaw went slack, and his hands began to tremble so violently that he had to grab the edge of the conference table just to keep himself upright. His brain was short-circuiting, desperately trying to reconcile the image of the submissive, boring woman he had humiliated at a steakhouse with the terrifying corporate titan currently walking toward the head of the table. He physically shrank, his shoulders collapsing inward, the fake bravado completely evaporating from his velvet tuxedo. He was staring at the grim reaper of his own financial existence. Julian was entirely paralyzed. The arrogant tech bro who loved to lecture me about venture capital stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He looked from the glowing Vanguard Trust logo on the projector screen, down to my white suit, and back up to the private executive doors I had just walked through. The math was slowly coming together in his head, and the answer was utterly devastating. He realized in real time that the billion-dollar syndicate he was trying to scam was entirely under my control. The woman he had treated like an uneducated housewife was the sole gatekeeper to his fabricated dreams. Chloe sat perfectly still on the leather sofa, her face frozen in an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She recognized Victoria immediately from the society magazines. The realization that her brother was not just getting a divorce, but was actively being hunted by the most lethal financial attorney in Atlanta left her completely speechless. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest as if it could somehow protect her from the incoming fallout, her previous arrogance replaced by pure terror. But Sierra did not understand the dynamics of the room. She was entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in power taking place. Sierra still operated under the delusion that I was just a bitter, jealous ex-wife who had somehow tracked them down to ruin their special night. She let out a loud, dramatic scoff, rolled her eyes, and stood up from the sofa. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance, and shouted across the room. She aggressively demanded to know what I was doing there, asking if I had followed them to the hotel like a desperate stalker. She told me I was embarrassing myself and that I needed to leave the boardroom immediately before the actual investors arrived to kick me out. I did not even break my stride. I did not turn my head to look at her. I did not acknowledge her existence with a single syllable or a sideways glance. Before the final word even left her mouth, one of my security contractors moved with terrifying speed. He stepped directly into her path, his massive frame completely blocking her view of me. He did not speak a word. He did not touch her. He simply stared down at her with a look of such absolute chilling authority that Sierra instantly choked on her own breath. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into the edge of the sofa, suddenly realizing that this was not a reality television argument. She was standing in a room with people who possessed the power and the capital to erase her entirely. She sank back into the leather cushions, her face flushing crimson with profound embarrassment, and remained completely silent, staring at her lap in fear. I reached the head of the conference table and stood behind the heavy leather executive chair. I looked up at the massive projection screen, my eyes tracing over the stolen code and the fraudulent financial projections of Apex Logistics Solutions that they had proudly displayed. Then I slowly lowered my gaze to meet Marcus's terrified, pleading eyes. The man who had told me I was not remarkable enough was currently suffocating under the weight of my presence. I took my seat. Victoria placed her heavy leather briefcase onto the polished granite surface, the metallic snap of the latches cutting through the dead silence like a blade. My forensic accountants took their positions standing silently behind my chair, their screens glowing in the dim light. I folded my hands together, resting them perfectly on top of the dark stone table. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing minute, ensuring that the sheer weight of my authority had fully settled over the room, crushing whatever tiny remaining sliver of hope they had brought in with them. I finally spoke, my voice calm, smooth, and echoing softly against the dark mahogany walls. I formally welcomed them to the Vanguard Trust. I told them that punctuality was a trait I highly valued in prospective investments, and I was pleased to see they had arrived exactly on time. I looked directly at Julian, addressing the smug assumption he had made back at his rented office space. I told him I understood he was expecting an old, out-of-touch billionaire who could easily be swayed by shiny graphics and basic tech industry jargon. I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp expression that offered absolutely no mercy. I told him I sincerely hoped that I, the sole chairperson and majority beneficiary of the fund, was not a disappointment. The silence following my introduction was absolute and heavy, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He produced nothing but a sharp, pathetic gasp for air. Before he could attempt to formulate a single excuse, I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers twice. The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom opened again. If a camera were capturing this, it would pan slowly across the bloodless, horrified faces of Marcus, Julian, Chloe, and Sierra, as 6 of the most prominent venture capitalists in Atlanta walked into the room. These were the exact same billionaires Julian had been desperately trying to impress on the ballroom floor just an hour ago. They were the senior board members of the Vanguard Trust. They walked in absolute silence, taking their seats along the polished granite table, their faces completely impassive. I had invited them specifically to witness this execution. I wanted the entire Atlanta investment community to see exactly what kind of men Marcus and Julian truly were. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a screaming match or a bitter lover's quarrel. I simply gestured to Victoria. She reached into her leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of bound forensic audits, and dropped them onto the center of the table. The heavy thud echoed through the silent room. I looked directly at Julian. I told him that his pitch deck was incredibly visually appealing. I complimented his choice of glossy paper and aggressive typography. But then I told him that the complex logistical code printed on page 14 was quite familiar to me. I turned my attention to the board members who were now reviewing the copies Victoria had handed them. I explained in a cold, clinical tone that the revolutionary algorithm Apex Logistics Solutions was presenting today was actually my proprietary intellectual property. I detailed precisely how Marcus had photographed the whiteboards in my home office and illegally copied raw data files from my personal secured server. The camera would track slowly across the room, capturing Julian, shaking his head in a futile, silent denial, his entire tech bro persona dissolving into pure terror. I then delivered the fatal blow to his fabricated career. I informed the room that the stolen code was not even a functional product. I told them it was a defective prototype I had personally scrapped 2 years ago because my stress testing revealed it contained a catastrophic mathematical bottleneck. I looked Julian dead in the eyes and explained that if any investor had funded this project, his stolen software would have caused a massive supply chain blackout within 48 hours of deployment. A collective murmur of profound disgust rippled through the seated board members. In under 3 minutes, Julian was publicly branded not just as an intellectual property thief, but as a spectacular, incompetent liability. Next, I turned my gaze to Marcus. He was gripping the edge of the wooden presentation podium so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked as though he was about to physically collapse right there in his velvet tuxedo. I asked my accountants to project the financial audit onto the massive screen behind me. The Apex Logistics logo vanished instantly, replaced by high-resolution scans of Marcus's bank statements, his commercial loan applications, and his forged signatures. I did not scream at him about his infidelity or his cruel words at the steakhouse. I spoke exclusively in the language of federal crimes. I pointed to the screen and explained to the investors that Marcus had falsified his income to secure a massive commercial business loan. I highlighted the exact transfer of funds from the bank to his newly formed shell company. I then showed the board members how the very first disbursement of that corporate loan did not go towards software development, server space, or operational costs. It went directly to a Cartier boutique at Phipps Plaza. I stated clearly and firmly that Marcus had committed wire fraud, bank fraud, and the gross embezzlement of commercial funds simply to purchase luxury jewelry for his 26-year-old mistress. The camera would immediately cut to Sierra. She was physically sliding away from Marcus on the leather sofa, pressing herself against the armrest, as if he were highly contagious. She looked absolutely terrified, her hand frantically covering the Cartier bracelet on her wrist, suddenly realizing she was wearing stolen property purchased with federal loan fraud money. Chloe had buried her face in her hands, quietly sobbing. The arrogant woman who had mocked my simple clothing was now realizing her husband and her brother were about to face serious federal prison time. Her entire social standing, the fake wealth she loved to flaunt on the internet, was disintegrating in real time. The managing partner of the syndicate, a ruthless gray-haired billionaire who had politely humored Julian's networking attempts earlier in the evening, stood up from the table. He did not address Marcus or Julian directly. He looked at me and formally thanked the Vanguard Trust for exposing this severe liability before any capital was deployed. He then turned to the two men standing frozen at the front of the room and delivered their professional death sentence. He told them that as of this exact second, their names, their shell company, and their stolen pitch deck were being flagged to every single venture capital firm, commercial bank, and private equity syndicate in the Southeast. They were permanently blacklisted. He assured them they would never secure a single dollar of investment capital in this city or any other city ever again. The board members stood up in perfect unison. They did not shake hands. They did not offer any parting advice. They simply turned and walked out of the boardroom in complete disgust, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open behind them. The sound of their expensive leather shoes tapping against the marble hallway echoed loudly, taking Marcus and Julian's entire future away with them. The room felt incredibly empty, yet suffocatingly heavy. The sheer magnitude of their ruin finally crushed whatever delusion Marcus had left holding him up. His legs gave out. He collapsed onto his knees on the polished granite floor, his expensive velvet tuxedo pooling around him in a pathetic heap. He looked up at me, tears finally spilling down his face, his chest heaving with panic. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to find the words to beg for his life, his freedom, and his marriage. But I simply looked down at him, my expression completely unchanged. I had told him to go find better, and he had foolishly brought his search right back to my doorstep. The transition from the blinding lights of the executive boardroom to the cold, muted darkness of my bedroom 2 weeks later was a study in absolute contrast. If a camera were directing this moment, it would cut away from the ruined men on the granite floor and jump forward in time, establishing a completely different atmosphere. The shot would begin outside the lens, gliding slowly along the massive rain-streaked glass of my penthouse windows. A heavy, relentless storm was washing over the city of Atlanta, blurring the neon lights of the skyline into soft, watery streaks. The camera would push through the glass, moving silently into the dim, cool sanctuary of my master suite. It would track slowly forward, closing in on my silhouette, as I stood perfectly still by the window, looking out over the empire I commanded. The time was exactly 5 in the morning. I was awake, dressed in a silk robe, holding a crystal glass of deep red wine in my left hand and my glowing smartphone in my right. The phone vibrated violently against my palm, shattering the quiet rhythm of the rain hitting the glass. The caller identification displayed a name I had not acknowledged since the night of the gala. It was Julian. I did not answer immediately. I let the phone vibrate, allowing the agonizing seconds to stretch out, knowing that with every missed ring, the panic on the other end of the line was escalating into pure, unadulterated terror. On the final ring right before the call would drop to voicemail, I pressed accept and raised the phone to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I simply listened to the chaotic, breathless sounds coming through the speaker. The arrogant, condescending tech bro who loved to lecture me about venture capital and mock my modest wardrobe was completely gone. In his place was a broken, weeping mess of a man. Julian was sobbing so hysterically that his first few sentences were entirely incomprehensible. He was hyperventilating, choking on his own tears, his voice cracking as he begged me not to hang up. He pleaded with me to just listen to him for 1 minute, desperately trying to construct a lifeline out of thin air. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, savoring the complex, robust flavor, as the absolute destruction of my enemies played out live through the audio feed. Julian finally managed to catch his breath long enough to form a coherent sentence. He told me that the authorities had arrived. He described a scene of absolute chaos unfolding right at that very second outside the cheap leased apartment Marcus had rented after I evicted him. Julian was sitting in his car down the street, watching through the pouring rain as federal agents and local police executed a coordinated raid. He cried as he described the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the dark street. He told me that Marcus was currently being dragged out of the building in handcuffs, surrounded by armed officers, executing an arrest warrant for commercial bank fraud, grand larceny, and the forgery of corporate lending documents. But Julian did not call me to ask for mercy on behalf of his friend. He did not call to coordinate a legal defense for his business partner. The moment the consequences became real, the unbreakable brotherhood they had proudly boasted about on social media evaporated instantly. Julian turned on Marcus with a speed and ruthlessness that was almost fascinating to witness. He began violently throwing Marcus under the bus in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin. He swore to me, his voice trembling with manufactured innocence, that he had absolutely no idea the business loan was secured through fraudulent means. He claimed Marcus had lied to him, manipulated him, and hidden the financial paperwork. He swore he did not know the algorithm in their pitch deck was stolen from my private servers. Julian painted himself as a naive victim who had simply trusted the wrong man. It was a spectacular display of cowardice. The man who had proudly claimed to be the visionary mastermind behind Apex Logistics Solutions was now crying like a child, denying any involvement in the very company he had tried to use to secure $10 million just 14 days prior. Then came the real reason for the 5 in the morning phone call. Julian knew about the forensic audit I had ordered. He knew that my legal team had compiled a devastating, irrefutable dossier detailing every single illegal maneuver they had executed to create their shell company. He was terrified of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He knew that if my attorneys submitted that dossier to the federal regulators, his life would be entirely over. He begged me to hold the files back. He pleaded with me to keep his name out of the legal filings. He started bargaining wildly, offering up every miserable detail of their downfall as a sacrifice. He told me that Sierra had taken one look at the federal agent swarming the apartment building, grabbed her bags, and sprinted out the back exit, abandoning Marcus without a second thought. He cried that Chloe was currently having a severe panic attack in their living room because she had just realized that her own home had been listed as collateral for the fraudulent business entity. They were about to lose their house, their cars, and their entire standing in the Atlanta social scene. Julian sobbed into the phone, stating over and over again that they had nothing left, that their lives were completely destroyed, and that he would do anything I asked if I just showed him a fraction of mercy. I listened to his desperate bargaining with the cold, detached interest of a judge presiding over a closed trial. I felt no pity for the tears of a man who had actively encouraged my husband to discard me. I felt no remorse for a woman who had tried to build her socialite image by stepping on my dignity. They had played a highly dangerous, arrogant game, fueled by racism, misogyny, and pure greed, and they had fundamentally misunderstood the rules of the board. Julian stopped his frantic rambling, gasping for air, waiting in absolute agony for my response. The silence between us was profound, amplified by the sound of the rain beating relentlessly against the heavy glass of my windows. I let him sit in that dark, terrifying quiet, forcing him to feel the complete weight of his powerlessness. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I kept my tone as smooth and cold as polished ice. I spoke directly into the receiver, delivering the final, inescapable verdict that would permanently end his existence in the corporate world. I told him that he had sat at my dinner table, drank wine that I paid for, and confidently told my husband that he could easily find a better woman. I took a slow breath, letting the finality of the moment crystallize. I told Julian that he gave Marcus excellent advice to go find better, but he made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. He forgot to warn his friend that he should never, under any circumstances, attempt to steal from the absolute best. I pressed the red button on my screen, severing the connection instantly. I did not wait to hear his reaction. I blocked his number, blocked Chloe's number, and placed the phone face down on the windowsill. I raised my wine glass to the storm outside, taking one final, deeply satisfying sip. The execution was complete. If a camera were capturing the exact fallout of that severed phone call, the cinematography would undergo a violent, jarring shift. It would immediately abandon the smooth, steady glides that defined the quiet luxury of my penthouse. Instead, the shot would snap to a harsh, shaky, handheld perspective, perfectly mirroring the chaotic destabilization of Marcus's reality. According to the detailed police reports and the frantic voicemails my legal team intercepted over the next 48 hours, the scene at his leased apartment played out like a masterclass in catastrophic failure. The relentless Atlanta rain was still pouring when the authorities arrived. Marcus had rented a flashy, overpriced, luxury apartment in a high-rise building to maintain his illusion of bachelor wealth, completely unaware that his name had already been flagged across multiple federal databases. The handheld camera perspective would follow the heavy boots of the federal agents and local police officers as they marched down the brightly lit corridor. There was no polite knocking. There was only the deafening, violent crash of a tactical battering ram splintering the heavy wooden door straight off its hinges. Federal agents swarmed the apartment in a synchronized wave of shouting voices and blinding tactical flashlights. Marcus was standing in the center of the living room, still wearing the wrinkled trousers of the velvet tuxedo he had worn to the gala, looking at his phone in absolute shock because his brother-in-law had just hung up on him. He did not even have time to process the breach before two armed agents grabbed his shoulders, spun him around, and slammed him hard against the drywall. The cold, heavy, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the room. An agent read him his rights, shouting over the chaos. The charges were severe and inescapable. They cited commercial bank fraud, the forgery of corporate lending documents, and grand larceny. Officers immediately began tagging and seizing assets. They boxed up his laptop, his financial documents, and the fake pitch decks he had so proudly paraded around just hours earlier. Representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission were present alongside local authorities, ensuring that every single digital footprint of his shell company, Apex Logistics Solutions, was locked down for federal prosecution. Marcus tried to protest. He tried to use his loud, aggressive corporate voice to intimidate the officers, demanding that they unhand him and claiming there had been a massive misunderstanding. He shouted that he was a respected executive and demanded to call his lawyer. The lead agent simply pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus the frozen status of his bank accounts. The asset forfeiture orders had already been executed. Every single credit card in Marcus's wallet had been permanently locked. His personal checking account balance was absolute zero. The fraudulent corporate loan had been completely reclaimed by the issuing bank under the discovery of falsified collateral. His credit score, which had been artificially propped up by my silent financial interventions for 5 years, was entirely decimated. He did not just have $0 to his name. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal debt, and he possessed absolutely no means to hire a criminal defense attorney. But the most devastating blow to Marcus's ego did not come from the federal agents. It came from the woman he had chosen over me. The shaky camera would pivot to capture Sierra standing in the doorway of the master bedroom. The commotion had woken her up. She stood there in her silk pajamas, watching the man she thought was her multi-million-dollar ticket to high society being manhandled by federal authorities. Marcus looked at her with desperate, pleading eyes. He begged her to grab her phone. He told her to call Julian, to call anyone who could wire money for his bail. He looked at her, expecting the loyalty and submission of a devoted partner. Sierra did not panic out of love. She panicked out of pure, unadulterated greed and self-preservation. She took one look at the agents boxing up the apartment and immediately realized the money was completely gone. The wealthy executive she had been bragging about on social media was a fraud, and she was about to be tied to a sinking criminal ship. Her survival instincts kicked in with breathtaking ruthlessness. She ignored his pleas completely. Instead, she spun around and sprinted back into the bedroom. The handheld camera would follow her frantic movements as she grabbed her oversized Hermes tote bag, the exact bag Marcus had bought for her using the stolen corporate funds. She did not pack clothes. She did not pack toiletries. She opened the jewelry box on the dresser and began rapidly shoving every single valuable item she could find into the heavy leather bag. She made absolutely sure the $15,000 Cartier bracelet was securely fastened around her wrist. Marcus watched from the living room, struggling against the grip of the officers screaming her name. He begged her to help him. He shouted that he loved her and that they were a team. Sierra zipped the Hermes bag shut, threw it over her shoulder, and walked out of the bedroom. She did not stop to comfort him. She did not even look him in the eyes. She walked right past the federal agent, stepped carefully over the splintered remains of the front door, and disappeared down the hallway without looking back once. She took every ounce of liquid value she could carry and abandoned him to the federal justice system. Marcus was forced to watch the ultimate reality of his choices play out in real time. He had left a fiercely loyal, wildly successful wife who protected his peace, all for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable automated teller machine. When the machine broke, she simply walked away. The rippling shockwave of my financial blackout did not stop at Marcus's apartment. The camera would execute a rapid, chaotic cut to an affluent suburban neighborhood across town, where Julian and Chloe were currently experiencing their own catastrophic reality check. Julian had driven home in a state of absolute terror after I hung up on him. He had burst through his front door, waking Chloe up in the early hours of the morning, to confess that their entire startup venture was a scam and that the authorities were likely on their way. He had not just lied to Marcus about the pitch deck, he had lied to his own wife about the collateral he used to secure their initial operational capital. In order to legitimize the shell company and rent that flashy glass office space, Julian had secretly leveraged the deed to their marital home. He had taken out a massive high-interest secondary mortgage against the property, fully believing that the $10 million Vanguard Trust investment would cover the debt before the bank ever noticed. When the bank received the federal alert regarding the fraud investigation into Apex Logistics Solutions, they immediately triggered the default clauses on all associated loans. The consequences were instant and brutal. The camera would capture the absolute humiliation of Chloe's mourning. The woman who had spent the last 5 years turning up her nose at my modest wardrobe and bragging about her elite social standing was now standing on her manicured front lawn in her bathrobe. Two representatives from the bank, accompanied by local sheriff deputies, were formally executing a foreclosure and eviction notice. Because the loan was secured through fraudulent means, the bank was not legally required to offer them a grace period. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, screaming at Julian right there in the driveway, for all of their wealthy, highly judgmental neighbors to see. Julian stood paralyzed, his hands buried in his hair, completely unable to fix the mess he had created. He had spent his entire adult life acting superior, treating everyone around him like uneducated subordinates because of his race and his supposed tech genius. Now he was utterly exposed as a desperate fraud. His professional reputation in Atlanta was permanently destroyed. No venture capital firm would ever let him pass their lobby, and no reputable tech company would ever hire a man flagged by the Securities and Exchange Commission for intellectual property theft. Chloe collapsed onto the front steps of the house she no longer owned. She realized with crushing clarity that she had actively participated in the destruction of the only person in the family who actually possessed real wealth. She had cheered as her brother discarded me, completely unaware that she was cheering for her own financial execution. They were losing the house, their cars, and their entire social network. The wealthy friends they had partied with just days ago were already unfollowing them on social media, distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of a federal investigation. They had all believed they were apex predators in a high-stakes corporate jungle. They had mocked my quiet demeanor and mistook my silence for weakness. But as the flashing lights of police cruisers illuminated their ruined lives, the absolute truth finally settled over them. They were not predators. They were just arrogant tourists who had wandered too far into my territory, and I had systematically stripped them down to nothing. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the Fulton County Family Courthouse offered no place to hide. If the camera were to transition from the chaotic breakdown of Julian and Chloe's suburban eviction, it would cut sharply to the absolute suffocating silence of the courtroom. I sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, my posture impeccable, and my expression entirely unreadable. To my left sat Victoria, arranging her flawless legal binders with the calm, terrifying efficiency of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Across the aisle sat Marcus. The physical transformation was so profound it was almost difficult to look at him. The man who had worn custom velvet tuxedos and bragged loudly about his high net worth at expensive steakhouses was completely gone. In his place sat a hollow, trembling shell of a human being. Because all of his assets had been frozen and seized by federal authorities in the wake of the fraud investigation, he could not afford to retain a private divorce attorney. He was forced to represent himself. He wore a cheap, heavily wrinkled suit that hung loosely on his depleted, exhausted frame. He had aged 10 years in the span of a few weeks. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent in a holding cell and the crushing, inescapable weight of his impending federal criminal trial. The legal proceedings were brutal in their brevity. Marcus tried to stammer through a defense, attempting to invoke the demands he had originally sent through his discount lawyer. He weakly asked the judge for an equitable division of marital assets. He actually tried to argue that he had contributed to the emotional stability of our household, entirely ignoring the fact that he was currently out on bail for wire fraud and grand larceny. The judge, a stern, sharp-eyed woman who had clearly reviewed the mountain of financial evidence Victoria had submitted, did not even attempt to hide her profound disdain. She cut Marcus off mid-sentence, instructing him to sit down and remain silent. Victoria stood up and formally presented the prenuptial agreement. It was the exact same document Marcus had laughed at 5 years ago, the one he signed without reading, because he thought I was just a paranoid freelancer protecting a meager savings account. Victoria meticulously walked the judge through the ironclad clauses. She detailed the exact tracing of my corporate trusts, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Penthouse, the software company, and my vast investment portfolio were entirely shielded from marital property laws. She then presented the forensic financial audit, showing Marcus's unauthorized use of my funds to finance his fraudulent business loans and fund his affair. The judge did not deliberate for long. Her gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp final crack that echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. The ruling was absolute and merciless. Marcus was denied spousal support. He was denied any equity in the penthouse. He was denied access to any of my corporate or personal holdings. Furthermore, the judge ruled that the $15,000 Cartier bracelet he had purchased for his mistress, along with the outstanding debts from his fraudulent luxury auto leases, were his sole exclusive financial responsibility. I walked into that courtroom a wealthy, independent woman, and I was walking out with my empire entirely untouched. Marcus was walking out with absolutely nothing but a staggering mountain of debt and a looming federal prison sentence. As the court adjourned, Marcus stood up from his table. He looked across the aisle at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic panic. He took a hesitant step forward, opening his mouth as if he wanted to apologize, as if he wanted to beg for one final drop of the grace and protection I had provided him for 5 years. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I simply picked up my designer handbag, turned my back on him, and walked gracefully out of the courtroom. I left him standing there in his cheap suit, completely alone in the silent room, finally forced to face the cold reality of the miserable existence he had built for himself. The scene would shift one final time, cutting from the sterile courthouse to the warm, golden hour light of my penthouse. I stood in the center of my expansive living room, holding a crystal glass of vintage red wine. I walked slowly toward the floor, to ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling, glittering skyline of Atlanta. The city was alive, moving and breathing beneath me, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely and utterly free from the suffocating weight of someone else's fragile ego. If the camera were moving now, it would be a slow, steady pull-out. It would gradually drift backward, capturing my silhouette against the massive expanse of the glass and the towering skyscrapers beyond. I looked out at the empire I had built with my own hands, my own intellect, and my own relentless work ethic. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute power of my own independence running hot through my veins. Women are so often taught to shrink themselves, to make the men around them feel tall. We are conditioned to mute our brilliance, to hide our financial success, and to soften our sharpest edges so we do not intimidate fragile partners. I spent 5 years playing a supporting role in a play I was actually directing. I let a mediocre man believe he was a king simply because I loved him enough to protect his pride in a society that constantly told him he had to project wealth to matter. But when you build a pedestal for a man who did not earn the right to stand on it, he will eventually use that elevation to look down on you. Marcus thought my silence was weakness. He thought my lack of flashy designer logos meant I had no value. He told me he could find better because he genuinely believed his own fabricated hype. But the truth is, a man like Marcus can never find better. Men who operate on deceit and superficial validation are incapable of sustaining proximity to true greatness. They are drawn to shiny objects and empty promises because that is the exact reflection of their own hollow souls. Sierra abandoned him the moment the money vanished. Julian betrayed him the second the federal agents knocked on the door. Chloe turned her back when the bank repossessed her lifestyle. They were all playing a highly dangerous game of fake wealth, and the moment the house lights came on, the entire cast scattered like roaches trying to escape the glare of the truth. True power does not need to announce itself at a dinner table. It does not need to scream at a reception desk or post heavily filtered achievements on social media. True power is the quiet, undeniable force that moves the tectonic plates beneath their feet while they are busy looking at their own reflections. I did not have to shout to destroy him. I did not have to cry to heal myself. I simply stopped performing the exhausting labor of keeping his delusions afloat. I stopped writing the checks, and gravity did the rest. The slow pull out of the camera would continue the frame widening to show the vast, stunning luxury of the penthouse, emphasizing how incredibly small and insignificant Marcus's entire existence was compared to the world I had built. I stood tall against the glass, raising my wine glass, in a silent, solitary toast to the city that belonged to me. Do not ever let anyone convince you that you are not remarkable enough simply because they lack the mental capacity to understand your worth. Do not ever dim your light to keep an arrogant partner comfortable in the dark. Let them be intimidated. Let them leave. Let them tell you they can find better. When they do, politely hold the door open for them. Watch them walk out into the freezing reality of their own mediocrity. The sweetest, most devastating revenge you can ever enact upon people who try to destroy you is not anger. It is not bitter retaliation or public screaming matches. It is the absolute, unapologetic continuation of your own extraordinary success. You do not fight them in the mud. You simply ascend to a height where they can no longer even perceive your shadow. The camera would reach the far end of the room, my figure now a strong, unyielding silhouette against the vibrant, burning colors of the Atlanta sunset. The screen would slowly fade to pure black, leaving only the lingering truth of my survival and the absolute certainty of my unshakable power. The most profound lesson from this story is that you must never shrink your brilliance to accommodate someone else's fragile ego. We are often taught to mute our success to keep arrogant partners comfortable. However, when you build a pedestal for someone who did not earn it, they will inevitably use that elevation to look down on you. True power is quiet and strategic. It does not scream for attention or seek validation on social media. When people underestimate your worth and tell you they can find better, politely open the door and let them walk into their own mediocrity. If this story resonated with your own journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to join a community of strong individuals who absolutely know their true worth.